Hi students, Jimmy here. I wanted to talk about HTML, CSS, and how Codecademy makes those two things work together, which is the same way you should expect HTML and CSS to work together anywhere else on the web. But since we are using Codecademy, I thought it would be a great way to show that. So I have gone all the way to the end of the CSS course, the introductory CSS course. The second part of that is called Design a Button for Your Website, and here's my last version of it. It's not, I didn't do anything fancy. I just sort of followed the instructions. And you can see down here, I've got the green little box so that I've finished this. Now, up here at the top, I want you to notice there's index.html, where you've got all of the HTML code. And if you've been working through this, you've noticed that there's a CSS tab, stylesheet.css, which is separate than the HTML, from the HTML. You've got HTML code and CSS code, and the two have to work together. And if you look over here at the HTML code, you'll notice right there, there's an HTML tag called link. And you'll see there's an href equals stylesheet.css. That says that the HTML file and the CSS file are located in the same folder, on the same computer, so that when the browser opens up index.html, by default, if there's nothing but the file name inside this href thing, that means that the computer is going to assume the HTML file and the CSS are in the same folder and go looking for it. If it's not in that same folder, you're going to have to put the entire path here in the href, an absolute path. And when you're talking about web documents, that can be an incredibly bad idea, because if you move the HTML and CSS together, all you have to do is make sure they stay in the same folder no matter where they are, on your computer or on a web server or anywhere else. But in the case that you want to keep the two together no matter where they're located, if you try to put the absolute URL there, you'll have to change that every single time. So every time you move the file, you'd have to change the http:// blah blah blah. So by using relative links inside HTML code instead of absolute, generally, you're going to have an easier time moving HTML and CSS together. I want to show how to make this work. So I'm going to go to my HTML, highlight it all, copy it. I'm going to go to Text Wrangler. I'm going to paste it, File, Save As, and I'll call this, I already had a file name in mind. What was I going to call it? Codecademy.css. Codecademy.-css.html. And I'm going to save it on my desktop. And I'm going to switch back to my web browser, and I'm going to go over here to the stylesheet.css, and I'm going to have to save this file. It's not HTML, it's CSS, but you'll notice that there are some similarities and, of course, some big differences. If you've been working through these assignments and reading through the book, you'll notice that obviously, even though there's some similarities, clearly they're not the same kind of language. They are meant to be connected together. So I copied all of the CSS. I'm going to come back over to Text Wrangler, and I'm going to make a new text document from my clipboard, and I'm going to say File, Save As, and I've got to call it, hang on, let's delete all of that. It's got to be called stylesheet.css, because that's what the HTML thinks it's supposed to be called. If I call this something else, my style sheet or Codecademy styles or something like that, I've got to make that the file name that's inside the HTML. Where it said href equals open quote stylesheet.css, I would have to make the file name whatever I actually called it. So I'm going to make sure, notice that Codecademy-css.html is on my desktop, and so is stylesheet. They're in the same place. So I can get rid of my text editor for a minute, and get rid of Firefox for a minute. And I'm going to go over here to my FTP client. Now, I'm using Transmit because that's the one I prefer, but it doesn't matter what you use. You could use CyberDuck, you could use CuteFTP, you could use FileZilla, you could use something else I've never even heard of. All right, so I'm going to go over here. I'm going to copy my two HTML files, my HTML file, my CSS file, and I'm going to drag them into this folder. So you'll notice Codecademy-css.html, stylesheet.css. Drag and drop. They upload. I switch over to my web browser, and I'm going to type in the URL jn0074.peakofallpeas.net, Codecademy-css.html, Bing, there it is. And you'll notice that the CSS automatically works. All I need to know is the HTML file, and as long as the HTML file and the CSS are both there, everything's fine. So if I type stylesheet.css into my web browser, there's the CSS from Codecademy, and everything's working fine. So you've got to make sure to save both the HTML and the CSS, call the CSS the right thing, put it in the right place, and upload them both together to your FTP folder, and then bang, they're both on the web, and automatically the HTML will reference the CSS and everything will work out. Isn't that wonderful? All right, good luck.